Hello again, everybody. Welcome to the program. We have a very timely topic lined up for you today in Trent Talks in what we're calling the Great Mask Debate. Yes, it's me, Stephen Stone, Trent University Chancellor and proud alumnus. And I'm so pleased you're with us today, along with Trent faculty members, Dr. Sarah West, Director of the Kinesiology Program and Assistant Professor in Biology and in the Trent Fleming School of Nursing, and Dr. Kelly McGuire, Chair and Associate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies and Associate Professor in English. Sarah and Kelly will be filling us in on the science behind masks and explaining why we see such strong responses, positive and negative, to wearing them. As always, we would like to first respectfully acknowledge that Trent University is located on the treaty and traditional territory of the Michi-Saugig Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. Sarah and Kelly, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm curious to know a bit about your research focuses. Sarah, perhaps you could go first.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. I'm really happy to be here today with both of you to chat about this super important and really relevant topic. So in terms of my background and research area, my area of expertise is in exercise physiology and kinesiology. So my main program of research looks at physical activity and health in special populations. So a little more specifically, what I do is I look at physical activity and health in populations such as children with chronic diseases or in adults with chronic diseases. I'm also an adjunct scientist at Fit Kids in Toronto, where we work with a variety of groups of students. So what we do is we look at how physical activity is related to bone health, muscle health, psychosocial health in kids with a variety of chronic diseases and in adults with chronic diseases as well. So, I work with a variety of individuals and really just looking at that link between activity and well-being. I'm particularly interested in this topic about mask usage and mask exposure, et cetera, because recently I collaborated with some colleagues from the United States on an editorial discussing the physiology of mask use, picking apart about how masks actually impact things like oxygen status, use of masks in special populations, such as in those with chronic disease or those who exercise. And we've submitted that editorial for publication. It's still under review right now, but it just seemed like a very timely topic to discuss on the Trent Talks as well for myself.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you. Looking forward to that. And now, Kelly, could you tell us about your research focus?
Thanks, Stephen. I'm also grateful to be here as well and talking to you both today. And that was a fantastic introduction. My research is in the area of health humanities, which is actually a new option for students at Trent. And I focus on the cultural representation of disease from the 18th century to the present. I have a deep interest in the medical imagination and in how movements get organized to resist public health initiatives and how that relates to gender and social justice. So I've recently been working quite a bit on vaccine hesitancy in relation to COVID-19. And for me, some of this debate around the mask also has some connections to what we'll be talking about today. So thank you.
Wow, both of you are doing such interesting work. Thank you. Let's move right into our viewer-submitted questions. And Sarah, let's turn to you first. Both Trent's home communities, Durham and Peterborough, have made masks mandatory, and the campus now has a mask policy as well. How and why do masks work in helping to keep us all safe? And can you shed some light on the different types of masks, from N95 to homemade cloth, and how to wear them properly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are two really kind of important questions to first understand why we're even wearing a mask. So let's address that first question to begin with. So one of the main sources of transmission of the virus is through inhaled droplets from an infected person. And so these are droplets that can happen as a result from somebody coughing, sneezing, and actually even during talking or speaking, we produce some of these droplets. Actually, I came across a paper in a very high profile, reputable journal called the New England Journal of Medicine. And the scientists published their work very recently, and they looked at droplets that are produced by people who are speaking and talking. And it was really cool. They actually had some technology to visualize so that they could actually see the emission of the droplets. And what they found was that, yes, speaking itself, it does result in droplet production. But interestingly, if somebody covered their mouth with a damp washcloth, there was a large decrease in the number of droplets that were being emitted. Actually, even very close to the background level, meaning that they couldn't detect a high level of droplets when they covered their mouth with a damp washcloth. So that brings us to how the masks and face coverings basically work. And so it is relatively simple. They offer kind of a barrier, and they work by blocking the respiratory droplets that are being produced. So again, they're kind of like a barrier between yourself and another person and the exposure to the respiratory droplets. So to move on to the second part of the question, what types of masks are there? And we've heard a lot of talk about the different types of masks, in the media and, what to wear and what not to wear. And so kind of we basically have two major types of masks. We have what we can refer to as medical masks and non-medical masks. So some types of medical masks include ones that we've probably all heard of again recently, something called the N95 mask. So that mask is a really close, tight-fitting facial mask that covers the nose and the mouth, and it is a very efficient filtration of a lot of airborne particles. It often requires that health professionals be fit to them properly because the seal has to be so tight to wear these masks. So again, this type of mask is usually used primarily by medical professionals because it offers that very high-grade, tight seal and protection and blockage of these airborne particles. The next type of mask, which still kind of falls under that heading of medical mask, is the surgical mask. And so this is a more loose-fitting, disposable mask that still creates that physical barrier between kind of the mouth and nose of the wearer and any potential contaminants in the environment. That's kind of that typical blue mask that I think you were wearing in the introduction, Stephen. And so these particular masks, they're not intended to form a seal as tight or like the N95 mask, but they are still very effective. The last type of masks is that non-medical mask. And these are the ones that we are kind of paying attention to a little bit more now, is the ones that are our cloth masks. So these can be the homemade masks or store-bought masks that are use materials such as cotton and have multiple layers of cotton, but it's these fabric masks that are designed to decrease the transmission of the respiratory droplets during breathing, speaking, and coughing. So with our current recommendations and just the general population in public, the recommendation is to wear the non-medical face covering. So wearing those, fabric masks or a face covering that is non-medical. This helps preserve the medical masks for the healthcare professionals who do need them to be treating the patients. And basically, as I'll touch on a little bit later, the non-medical face coverings are effective for the purpose of wearing them kind of out in public. And to address the kind of final part of your question too, what's the proper way to wear the mask? And let's refer to the non-medical mask, the fabric mask. Basically, you want to wear the mask so that it's covering both your nose and your mouth. So you don't want to have it dipping below your nose, or you don't want to have it sitting above your mouth. We want to have it covering both the nose and the mouth when you're wearing it. And that would be the most effective way to wear the mask.
Well, and a follow-up question maybe for you, Kelly. What are some social barriers to mask wearing? Let's come at it a different way. And are there legitimate reasons for not wearing a face covering during this pandemic?
Yes, thank you. I think while we can all agree on the importance of the mask in keeping us safe, as I think Sarah just really effectively spoke to, we also need to acknowledge the social barriers that specific groups face, right? And that racialized men in particular are in a kind of double bind when it comes to the mask, right? If a Black man wears a mask, he may be subject to the scrutiny of people who consciously or unconsciously see him as a threat. But if he doesn't wear a mask, he may be scrutinized for violating public health directives and bylaws, right? Maybe more so than other people. Jasmine Zane at Laurier actually has been talking about this practice of mask tipping that's become sort of emerged during the last few months, right? Which involves people kind of going into stores, pulling down their mask for a moment to show their face, and then covering up the face again, almost to offer kind of reassurance, right? And I think that the fact that this practice is going on speaks to how some people in our society can circulate more freely than others, right? We're all subject to circumstances depending upon our race, gender, class, sexual orientation, ability, age, and so on, that affect how we wear the mask, right? So these conversations really need to be inclusive and take into account systemic reasons for why some people may be more hesitant than others. I would also mention that in the autism community, there has been a lot of concern expressed over mandatory face covering because some people have sensory issues that make wearing a mask really difficult, right? And there are also concerns that mask wearing might impede communication for the hearing impaired, for the elderly, perhaps. So these conversations just need to be inclusive for these and other reasons.
Yeah, and I mean, if I can kind of touch on that a little bit more as well, you bring up an important point. There might be certain populations that mask usage may not be the best for that particular population. So again, because I do work with a lot of populations with chronic disease, that's a special consideration as well. So certain individuals with chronic diseases may not be a good candidate for wearing a mask at all times. There was a research study that looked at patients, for example, who had chronic kidney disease. And they found that if these patients wore an N95 mask, so that really tight seal mask during some of their dialysis therapy, that their oxygenation levels actually dropped. So certain chronic diseases, individuals who have uncontrolled asthma, et cetera, it might be a special consideration. Those individuals should be consulting with their doctor to see if it is appropriate or not for them to be able to wear the non-medical face coverings in the public.
Well, and carrying on with you, Sarah, at the start of the pandemic, we were all told not to wear masks, and now they are mandatory in many communities and businesses. So this flip-flopping has likely added to the confusion and stress around masks. Can you offer some insights on why we've seen such a large pivot on mask wearing from the government and our public health officials?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. Absolutely. So while I cannot say for certain why public health and the government decided to change the recommendations, I can offer some suggestions that may have contributed. So I think one of the biggest things we need to first think about is that our knowledge regarding the virus itself is constantly changing, weekly, if not on a daily or even hourly basis. So as scientists and medical professionals have learned more about COVID, the understanding about how to manage it has changed. And this might mean a change in recommendations. So I was reading a scientific news article pretty recently that noted that as it was learned that the asymptomatic people could spread the virus more readily, the importance of everyone wearing a mask started to become more apparent. But for me, it's also the scientific evidence that's beginning to emerge that really supports the change in narrative to everybody wearing a mask. So for example, there was a recent study that was published in the journal Health Affairs. And what they did is they looked at the growth rate of COVID-19 before and after the required mask usage in a number of different states in the United States of America. And they found that the COVID-19 growth rate slowed directly as a result of mandating mask usage in public. And it was a significant growth rate reduction. So the authors, they actually did a bit of a study and they estimated that how much of a growth rate there was in terms of a change, and that between March 31st and May 22nd, when they conducted their study, they estimated that as a result of the mask mandate, more than 200,000 COVID cases were likely averted just by using the non-medical grade masks. And there's a number of studies that are being published that are kind of saying the same thing. So really, there's a lot of scientific evidence starting to demonstrate the importance of wearing a mask. So, I do understand that the flip-flopping, or what can appear to be this like mixed messaging, it can be confusing. I think what's important to know is that, information is fluid, science is fluid. We're learning more all the time. And this new research is really pointing to the fact that mask usage is important and it is effective.
Yeah, Sarah, it's interesting. I was just reading an article this morning about Health Canada's decision not to approve at-home testing on the grounds that Canadians won't do it properly, right? And what this article was suggesting was that there's a kind of paternalism in the decision, right? That was also perhaps at work in their decision back in April not to recommend mask wearing to the public, right? The suggestion that we maybe can't be trusted not to, touch our faces all the time, or to play with our masks, or, to do things that we're not supposed to do. And I think that now that we're in this mask culture, right, in August, one thing that we can highlight is the way people have taken control over the, or taking control by personalizing their masks, right, in this really kind of interesting way, and like humanizing them and so forth. But I really liked what you had to say just now. So.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely.
Well, and Kelly, let's carry on with you. There seem to be almost two camps of people when it comes to masks, those for and those against. Why do you think this is such a polarizing and political topic?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, everything seems polarizing these days, doesn't it? In some ways, I think the mask has really become a surface on which we project our values and beliefs. Some view the strip of cloth as a sign of docility. It's kind of the uniform of those who are brainwashed by state officials, while others see it as a kind of signifier of our responsibilities towards others, almost as a badge of empathy. And I think the mask in this sense is really revealing, right? It hides, but it also reveals something else. And what it shows us is that in North America, we are governed by these two very, dominant but distinct worldviews that, are kind of mutually exclusive, but have their own kind of internal coherence in a way. And I have to say that although public health has been politicized in extraordinary ways recently, this isn't altogether new, right? So there's a long history of resistance to public health measures, right? And mask refusal specifically. Even if we go back to the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, 1919, right? There were anti-mask leagues that were established in, San Francisco that were pushing back against these mandates. But I think that looking to other cultures globally, where the mask isn't as polarizing as it is here, is really instructive. What separates us from cultures in East Asia, for example, where wearing the mask is a basic sign of politeness and decency. And I think that a major factor might be the individualism that's dominated Western thought since the 18th century. This is the thinking that puts the self at the center and sets a really high value on personal freedom and decision-making and autonomy. And none of this is in itself a bad thing, but in today's world, what you see are kind of sociologists and cultural theorists kind of commenting on this quite often, the way in which the performance of the self is all important, right? Being visible, being vocal defines some people's sense of who they are. And it's difficult to express this identity when you're wearing a mask. And the last thing I would point to is that this thinking even informs how we look at disease, right? We see it as something that happens on a very intimate, kind of personal level, rather than as a social process. And, you know, even when we think about infectious disease, bioethicists point out that we tend not to see it as relational, right? And of course, this is a view that's not compatible with public health efforts. Julia Marcus, who's a prominent epidemiologist at Harvard, has been calling for more compassionate public health messaging as a way of kind of bridging this divide between those two worldviews that I was talking about earlier. And I think that we may need to pay close attention to what she's been saying as a kind of a way out of all of this.
Well, and I also wonder, there's an element of just, you know, change is happening all around us, and sometimes it's difficult to change. In North America, we haven't been used to wearing masks. I'm old enough to remember when seatbelts first came in, and there was a large contingent of people who were just very anti-seatbelts. But of course, now those people are few and far between. So we'll see how this progresses. Maybe people will become more comfortable. Having said that, we've all seen footage of physical confrontations in stores and elsewhere between the masked and the unmasked. Now, we Canadians have tended to look with some measure of horror to south of the border, where the mask debate has become, unfortunately, largely a matter of Trump supporters versus Trump haters. But before we get too smug, and maybe I'll ask this again of you, Kelly, but Sarah, feel free to chime in. Are we seeing mask refusal in Canada? And what other factors could play into the decision to refuse to wear a mask?
Thanks, Stephen. I thought the seatbelt analogy is a really good one. Just to speak to this kind of the physical confrontations, these kind of scenes in stores that are playing across social media and news right now. As someone who works on the masquerade tradition in literature, I find this conduct really interesting. If we go back to Carnival, which in Florence masquerade, the mask is connected to scandal because it hides the face while emphasizing the body. And it gives a kind of license to act out, to be different from who you are. And for me, you know, kind of coming out of this tradition, it's interesting that it's the people who are not masked who are acting out in this context. And again, I think this speaks to different levels of privilege in our society. Just like in the US, though, there's somewhat of a gender divide here, with more women than men wearing masks. Statistically, if you look to social media again or celebrity news, you'll see photos of straight couples stepping out, right, in which the male partner is not masked and the female partner has her face covered, right? And it's a really kind of interesting phenomenon. And I think some of it kind of stems from the rhetoric, again, that we're hearing in the United States that you were alluding to, Stephen. And it's rhetoric that has especially tended to denigrate the mask as emasculating, and there's my pun for today. But because the mask is somehow aligned with weakness, again, and passivity, it gets associated with the feminine, just because this is how our culture tends to work. So rather than appealing to collectivism, what we see are authority figures assuring people who are hesitant that mask wearing won't undermine their masculinity, right? So that's one kind of factor in terms of gender that we're seeing, but I think, again, we share across the United States and Canada. But in regards to the second part of your question, Stephen, I would say, obviously, if we look to our legal and political systems, right, in the United States, these are more strongly tied to protecting individual rights and interests than perhaps they are in Canada, where we have more of a tolerance for big government. At least we did for the first couple of months of this pandemic, I think. But just like Americans, we don't like being told what to do. Right. So we are seeing protests here on a bit of a smaller scale, though, I would say. And again, I think we tend to be more science accepting than Americans, perhaps. And perhaps on some level, we're less willing to cite religious reasons for refusing to wear the mask. But I think also here we have a well-established infrastructure that's been put in place by the anti-vaccination movement, which of course is skeptical of, of expertise and science, and tends to conflate both of these with elitism, right? So in some ways, based on the kind of the research I've been doing, mask refusal seems to be an extension of these anti-vaccination positions, but also give us a preview of what we might expect to see, when a vaccine for COVID-19 is available. That's a kind of grim note to end on. But.
Well, I mean, I think that, that was a lot of wonderful information to kind of consider with regards to mask refusal here in Canada. And something that I thought I would kind of, tack on at the end too was kind of pulling on along the same lines of what you were discussing, is that, you may see individuals who are out and they're like, well, everyone else is wearing a mask. Why does it make a difference if I make a mask too? Like, maybe I'll just leave my mask off because everyone else is, so we're good to go. But I did kind of stumble across a piece of interesting information that was recently published as well, again, in an academic journal, based on the science, is that, overall, we should be aiming for 100% compliance with mask usage, because that is really, truly the best case scenario. But in this other particular research study, and what they did was they used different modeling systems. So it was kind of like a computer modeling scenario as opposed to real study in the environment. But they used this simulation to estimate how effective mask usage was. And they found when at least 80% of the population is wearing a mask, this does lead to improved and significant improvements in virus transmission. When it got down to 50%, so when there was 50% or less individuals wearing a mask, the results on virus transmission was minimal. So there was not really an effect of mask usage when there was about half of the people or less wearing a mask. So I think kind of an interesting takeaway too is it really is a group effort. We really have to kind of be in this together, because as we chatted about in the previous question, there might be some instances where an individual is not able to wear a mask. So we need to really kind of aim to do our part and, approach this as a kind of group, thing.
Well, thank you both. And I love I hadn't thought of it before, but emasculation, and I guess to the positive side, masculinity. Now, as our viewers know, the final question that I always like to ask is, are there some positive takeaways and lessons related to the pandemic and today's discussion? And maybe Sarah, you first.
Sure. So one thing that I can think of that actually just kind of draws from what I just spoke to was, at least to me, it's become quite clear that we're kind of in this battle of the virus and COVID-19 together. So we're in this all together. We're not alone in this fight against the virus. We are approaching this from a community perspective. And so bringing in that sense of community and each doing our part, if something as simple as wearing a mask, to me, that's actually a little bit comforting. That makes me feel good. We're all working together towards this common goal. We have, our scientists doing research on the vaccine, medical professionals who are out there taking care of those who are sick. And we have essential workers, from those who are staffing and stocking our grocery stores to delivering our necessary products. We're all working together to try to make it through this. So again, taking away that isolated feeling, which can sometimes be felt with dealing with something of this magnitude, wearing a mask, feeling, you're not connected to somebody. Actually, we are very connected, and we kind of are working in all of this together. So that was kind of my positive final thought about it.
Well, and Kelly, do you have a final positive thought for today?
Yes, I think I'm just going to echo a lot of what Sarah was just saying. I've been reading studies lately that have been talking about how the pandemic has changed the way we experience public spaces and even the grammar of living together. And I think the mask has a lot to do with this. And not all of it has to be bad, right? One argument that one scholar was making was that perhaps we'll be less likely to police Muslim women moving forward. And also, I think we can take some hope maybe from looking to the younger generation, right? To the kids even, whose early exposure to mask wearing may in fact help shift Western perceptions of disease and social responsibility over time. Maybe we will become, like cultures again in East Asia, where if you have a cold, and you're taking public transit, it just becomes second nature to wear a mask, right? So perhaps this is something that we might see moving on. Finally, I think if we look to Indigenous cultures, we can see that many have long recognized the transformative possibilities of the healing mask. And I think maybe there's an opportunity here to remind ourselves of our shared community and vulnerability as well. So maybe the mask, which many anthropologists speak of as, in terms of its kind of transformative potential, right? Maybe it will, have that kind of ability to kind of produce social cohesiveness, which we seem to have lost, right? While being kind of in a state of, of lockdown. Perhaps we might kind of reconceptualize it even as a symbol of empathy, perhaps, but I think I'll stop there. So.
Okay, well, that was wonderful. Thank you both, Kelly and Sarah, for spending your time with us today and giving us your insights. And thanks also to everyone at home for joining us. Please tune in again 2 weeks from now on Wednesday, September the 16th, when we'll be unpacking cancel culture with Dr. Liam Mitchell and Dr. Carlene Pendleton Jimenez. Another very timely topic. I'm looking forward to this. In the meantime, let's keep the conversation going by submitting questions for our next installment and continuing the general discussion on social, as always, using the hashtag TrentTalks. Until then, be safe, and please always remember you are not alone. Goodbye for now.